With the release of Control, we saw another great step forward for the integration of real-time ray tracing in video game graphics. But if you remember, 1 year ago, Nvidia took the stage at Gamescom and was pushing 2 evolutions in real-time rendering: ray tracing acceleration through the RT Core and other Turing enhancements, and machine learning accelerated rendering through the use of the Tensor Core. Practically in games, this meant deep learning supersampling, or DLSS. DLSS leverages pre-calculations from a massive trained image set on servers, utilizes those pre-calculations at real time on the GPU tensor cores to take an image internally rendered at a lower resolution and turn it into a much higher resolution image. The program on the tensor cores infers this missing pixel detail between the two images. Historically, until today with Control, this meant taking a 1440p image, for example, up to 4K by inferring what a 4K image looks like in real time on the GPU. This idea should sound very familiar to longtime DF viewers, as we have covered so many techniques in the past which aim to do something very similar. They are collectively called image reconstruction techniques in general, and really started to get popular as the PlayStation 4 Pro came about. Checkerboard rendering, temporal injection, temporal accumulation, the MSAA trick. These names describe a variety of ways to take an image with less information, combining that with knowledge of pixels over time, and making that image look closer to an image of a much higher resolution. We have seen that technology evolve over time with good implementations like God of War or Tom Clancy's The Division 2, or with more mixed results in games like Dragon Quest XI or Red Dead Redemption 2. Along with pushing forward real-time rendering and ray tracing, I think Control showcases an advanced and deep learned image reconstruction that is particularly compelling. DLSS had a mixed launch after August last year regarding its implementation and the actual in-game results. In a game like Final Fantasy XV, it offered a good alternative to native resolution with TAA, yet that game has a notoriously blurry temporal AA, and in general the game has many dithered elements. DLSS could fix these elements while actually rendering at a lower internal resolution, and offered that performance advantage. But the game did not have a great starting baseline of comparison. Then you have integrations like Metro Exodus, where it was very unsharp at launch, producing a more stable image, but being of an actual lower perceptual resolution than the real internal resolution that it was reconstructed from. It was actually a 1440p image being turned into a 4K one, yet it looked less detailed than a 1440p native image. That was drastically changed in a post-launch patch, making it sharper and more detailed. But that took time after the game was launched. So the quality of DLSS could be a good alternative to native rendering resolution, but it had its own compromises, and it took time to get there, such as in Shadow of the Tomb Raider or in Anthem, where it took a long time to be implemented into game. Furthermore, compounded with this was the lack of user control. DLSS's internal resolution and options were one-dimensional. You turned it on for the output resolution, and the driver or game developer decided the actual internal resolution that would be used for you. That was different from GPU to GPU. I'm in general not a fan of taking away control, especially if you compare DLSS to other image reconstruction techniques, such as those found in Gears 5 or Tom Clancy's The Division 2. In these games, they offer incredible image quality very close to native resolution images and stills, while also allowing you, the user, to control their internal resolution in a granular way. That is great as I see it. DLSS, as it is present in Control, takes a great stride in addressing these aforementioned problems. Firstly, you have the option itself, which is now a tick box separate from the chosen internal resolution. With the DLSS in Control, you can control the internal resolution of the image before DLSS itself enhances that image to make it look much closer to a higher resolution one. For 4K, for example, on the RTX 2080 Ti, you have the ability to choose an internal resolution of 1920 by 1080 or 2560 by 1440, which is then reconstructed into a 3840 by 2160 image. Those are only two options in the menu here, But thanks to the user IC on Reset Era, I also learned that you can change the internal resolution in the game's config file to any resolution between 1/4 of the output resolution and that output resolution itself. So the minimum resolution for 1440p output is 720p. A minimum internal resolution for the output resolution of 4K is 1080p. But any resolution between those two numbers is fair game. DLSS can actually have many internal resolutions. You just need to edit the INI file to do that. Doing this, you can even utilize DLSS as a full-on replacement for native resolution rendering with TAA by setting the input resolution to the same resolution as the output resolution. This then replaces the native TAA resolve with DLSS, which then handles edges. It's kind of funny here how Nvidia at the Turing launch made mention of DLSS 2X, which was supposed to be an anti-aliasing alternative at native resolution to replace TAA. Well, that actually never made it into any game at all. And here with Control, you can kind of force the game to do that actually. Unintentionally, of course, by the developers or Nvidia. So finally, you have the ability to arbitrarily manipulate the actual internal resolution of DLSS. Not in the menu, but at least you can do it. Then you have the quality of DLSS in this title, which is quite different than in the past. As I mentioned before, DLSS offered greater than internal resolution image quality, but it took some time. So 4K DLSS with an internal resolution of 1440p in the games where it was actually implemented well, looked better on average than native 1440p with TAA. But regardless of that, DLSS still had a certain look and style to it that I've mentioned before. It completed undersampled lines as shown here in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where the line here is actually completed with DLSS on, but it left a slightly thickened and painterly look to a lot of the image. If you take a look at Control, the resolve of DLSS, as in the image it produces, looks very different than the DLSS resolve found in other titles such as Anthem or Metro Exodus. First, I think a good place to start is the game itself utilizing native upscaling from 1080p with its native temporal anti-aliasing up to 4K. So here the internal resolution of the image is 4 times smaller than that output resolution. Here we are at optimized settings I derived in my original Control video, with no multi-sample anti-aliasing and all of the ray tracing options selected to on. So at 1080p it is a very heavy game here, as you can see. It's already skirting the line of 60 FPS. Edge quality is okay with TAA, but it is notably soft and it is quite obviously 1080p. You even get some flicker from thinner lines caused by that TAA. Now let's ramp up the resolution to native 4K. Now that is a very clean image with impeccable lines. That thin line flickering is also heavily reduced. With native 4K rendering, you can immediately see all the individual detail in high resolution textures, and that general fuzziness and soft edges disappear. The frame rate though has taken a nosedive, dropping nearly 61%. This is not at all playable in spite of how pristine the image quality is. Control is one of those games where the internal resolution of rendering correspondingly scales up the quality of the resolution of its various effects, with or without ray tracing being on. So it makes all effects that much more expensive. But what happens if we take an internal resolution of 1080p and utilize DLSS to reconstruct that image up to 4K? Going from 1080p internal resolution with TAA to 1080p internal resolution with DLSS shows how DLSS takes ragged edges visible with TAA and turns them into pristine, straight lines. This is visible across the entire image and even on curved edges. And if you look here on the curved edge of this driving wheel, the DLSS version even reduces that kind of fatter pixel edge look from the 1080p with TAA image to fit inside a 4K grid. It is essentially generating detail beyond that 1080p image. That difference that I'm talking about actually can be seen really well in noise generated in a 1080p DLSS image versus noise generated in a 1080p TAA image. Here in the shadow in the 1080p DLSS image, you can see a single pixel noise generated in the shadow. That pixel there is aligned with the 4K image grid. It is a detail only visible at 4K, since it is a single pixel. If you switch over to 1080p, you can see how the size of the image noise is roughly 4 times larger. It is 4 pixels, and it aligns with the 1080p pixel grid. No amount of sharpening will make that noise in the 1080p TAA image look anything like the noise in the 1080p DLSS image. This is a very important distinction here. DLSS is not just a simple post-process, nor are any other image reconstruction techniques. It takes information from those neural network weights and information over time based upon motion vectors and infers or generates new information into a higher resolution pixel grid. Sharpening, on the other hand, works within that same 1080p pixel grid and locally changes the contrast of edges. It cannot make a ragged edge straight. Rather, it will amplify the contrast of that ragged edge, making it more ragged, actually. DLSS should not be compared to a standard single-frame image post-processing, such as sharpening. Sharpening and image reconstruction are 2 different things, and there's nothing stopping a user from utilizing both at the same time, should the user so wish. Comparing standard sharpening to DLSS is amalgam to comparing sharpening to MSAA almost. It doesn't make that much sense. Moving beyond edges though, you can also see how inner surface detail is generated by DLSS into that 4K pixel grid, whereas the 1080p pixel size in the TAA images leaves them soft and without detail. The last bit of improvement comes from flickering edges found in that original 1080p TAA image, which DLSS manages to dramatically reduce. While doing all of this, DLSS drops performance by just 6% with a 1080p internal rendering resolution. This is the power of image reconstruction techniques in general. They allow for higher quality rendering effects and maintain a good standard of image quality beyond that of their true internal resolution. But it is just a reconstruction, a facsimile of a 4K image. It is not the real thing, so it has faults. If you put that same 1080p internal DLSS image against a real native 4K image with TAA, you see some big differences. The first of the big differences is that inner surface detail is much higher on a real native 4K image in comparison to one that is 1080p internally with DLSS. DLSS is using an inferred average to generate its pixels, so it tends to over-average versus the real thing. It softens surface detail in comparison. Likewise, features inside effects that scale with resolution are finer at native resolution. Ray-traced reflections at native 4K are done with 4 times as many rays as 1080p DLSS. That makes them more realistically sharp and less noisy than the 1080p DLSS reflections. This would apply to all effects which scale with the real internal resolution of the game. And even those generated edges that DLSS does so much better than TAA are more or less inferred generated edges. Those edges are approximates of the real edges of 4K, and the native resolution 4K image manages to capture them in a way that leaves them with starker lighting. They just look crisper. That's a curious thing. DLSS in general manages to recognize and produce edges in a way that is generally better than TAA, as shown in 1080p TAA versus 1080p DLSS images. If you actually take a native 4K image with TAA and edit the config file to make the game apply DLSS to that same native 4K image, you can see how it completes lines on edges that even native resolution TAA cannot complete, like here on the wall. But there's a downside with DLSS actually. DLSS seems to want to generate straight, pristine lines in areas where they do not actually appear, like here in the distance on the concrete. With TAA on in 4K, you can see how the edge of the concrete is in fact beveled and has a normal map applied to it. It makes the lighting fall off in a rounded and graduated way. DLSS, on the other hand, turns that into a completely straight edge, even though the underlying geometry does not really look that way. If you put all 3 of these types of images next to each other, it shows it off well. DLSS is an approximation of a higher resolution, but it's not the same thing. Its utility is there to extract performance while maintaining a higher image quality, a higher sharpness, and a higher edge cleanness than that plain lower internal resolution. I think these are impressive jumps here in quality and visual output, and they defy my expectations actually. The internal resolution of 1080p with DLSS in Control looks better than previous DLSS implementations where the internal resolution was much higher at 1440p. How did that happen exactly? Examining that DLSS resolve more closely, I think reveals how DLSS works differently this time. In stills, the DLSS image manages to not look like an internal native resolution, but as the camera moves, the internal native resolution reveals itself again. Like here, as I move the camera back and forth and stand still, it is possible to see how the edge on this yellow railing here resolves to a more pristine 4K looking edge over time. But in movement, it looks of a much lower resolution and it showcases a very ragged edge. If I stop the movement and put both of the edges side by side, one where the edge was in motion and one where it was still for a few frames, you can see how DLSS seems to work over time. It works temporally. In motion and for objects in motion, that breaks down, revealing the internal real resolution. This is easy to see here with this moving fan. As the fan blades cover up the wire grid behind them, you can see how they distort and fizzle with DLSS versus a native resolution image. It looks like the resolution is pulsing from a higher to a lower one. As I see it, I would infer here that DLSS in Control is working differently than those before. It is more like a temporal accumulation style of reconstruction we've seen in other games, such as Tom Clancy's The Division 2 or For Honor. Like in those games too, the temporal stability of the image reconstruction increases in Control the higher the actual real internal resolution of that image is. So if I were to run the internal resolution of Control at 1440p or even higher, the reconstructed 4K image looks closer to the real 4K, and it also showcases less differences between the two in motion. This is kind of a surprising turn of events. DLSS in this game acts more like other styles of reconstruction we've seen, but that's not how DLSS was originally marketed. But if you look close enough, the information to this change is actually out there if you read carefully. Reading the Nvidia blog on how DLSS works in Control, they describe it as an image processing implementation, an approximation for a machine-learned model reconstructing images. So DLSS in Control is just a cheaper approximation not running on an inference-based AI, as according to Nvidia, that machine-learned model that they're currently testing is too expensive to run in real time on the GPU. And according to my reading of the Nvidia blog, it seems like this image processing version of DLSS is not even running on the tensor cores necessarily, as Nvidia's next step is optimizing their AI research model to run at higher FPS. Turing's 110 teraflops are ready and waiting for this next round of innovation. So it sounds to me like the 110 tensor teraflops are still waiting to be utilized, which begs the question, if the tensor cores are not being utilized necessarily for this version of DLSS, why can't this version of DLSS be ported to non-Turing architectures like Pascal? But that's just my theory crafting. DLSS in Control looks to be a step forward for image reconstruction quality in comparison to the past, but it also seems to work differently, and it makes me curious how Nvidia will actually evolve and implement DLSS in the future. Will it be this more image processing way, or will it actually use AI? Furthermore, Control's implementation offers a greater granular control and quality for DLSS, but they need to go one step further as I see it. DLSS should allow the user total control over the real internal resolution of the image before DLSS is applied, in the game menu itself, like in other games that offer image reconstruction. Likewise, DLSS should offer, if possible, granular control over how temporally stable it is, or conversely, how sharp that inferred image is. I think all options should be exposed to the user. Whew, that sure was a lot of discussion on some very small details. But like I said in my original Control video, the DLSS story in Control is just too curious to glaze over. And hopefully your eyes did not glaze over while watching this video. And if they did not, and you actually enjoyed it, then hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you are already a subscriber, then please consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to talk to me about image construction in general, or DLSS in Control, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen. But before I go, as a little bonus here, let me give props to Remedy for a little detail. While producing this video, a patch dropped for the game that completely eliminated the grainy, noisy nature of the indirect diffuse lighting or diffuse global illumination that the game launched with, so it looks much better now than it did on launch. Also, a driver dropped from Nvidia as well, which heavily reduced hitching in combat, as is shown in a number of portions of this video that used the newer patch. And the only thing left to say is bis zum nächsten Mal.